Please.
Okay, very good. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all in this webinar on the monitoring and informing the global biodiversity framework, how the SEEA can inform on this framework. This webinar is part of a broader series organized by the UN Committee on Environmental Economic Accounts to further explore the use of the SEEA for policy. My name is Ilaria Di Matteo, and I'm the Chief of the Environmental Economic Accounting Account Section in the United Nations Statistics Division. And I also had the pleasure to serve in the ad hoc technical expert group of the Conference of Parties for the review and the monitoring for the global biodiversity framework. So I had the pleasure to participate in the discussion on the indicator for the convention. This webinar, I wanted to highlight maybe just one aspect. This webinar brings together the community, the statistical community, the focal points for the biodiversity, researcher, academic, and the community. And the idea is that the collaboration between the statistical community and the biodiversity community is particularly important in order to combine effort and build more efficient and effective information system to support the monitoring of the biodiversity and achieve the vision of the global biodiversity framework. So this link is also recognized by the Conference of Parties, which in its decision 5 noted the importance of aligning with the system of environmental accounting and with the statistical community at large. And also it was noted by the UN Statistical Commission that encouraged the statistical community to engage with biodiversity community in order to mainstream biodiversity and support the framework. So I hope that this webinar gives you an overview of the global biodiversity framework and also the SEEA and how the SEEA can contribute, can inform the framework, so that maybe it can be a catalyst for a further collaboration, both at national level, international level, and so that as a whole, we try to build the information system that support the monitoring framework of the convention. I will now pass the floor. I wish you a very interesting, I hope it's an interesting discussion. I pass the floor now to Jonathan Koo, who is the program manager of the Physical Environment Accounts and Statistics at Australia Bureau of Statistics. And we are very lucky that he's the chair of a working group of the UN Committee of Experts on Environmental Economic Account and led the work of this working group in the organization of this webinar. Yes. So, Jono, I'll pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ilaria. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, the Turrbal people. These lands used to be known as Meanjin, or the place of the blue water lilies, and is now more commonly known as Brisbane. In Australia, it is customary to provide an acknowledgement of country. This Act acknowledges the critical contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in ensuring we have the lands we do to work, play, grow, and is an important mark of respect. At school, I remember taking history classes which focused on the last 220 years of British colonialisation in 1788. There was little focus on the tens of thousands of years that Australians First Nations people have been caring for the lands and waters in which we now all live. Now school curriculums have changed and my children have a better appreciation of that history. It's practices like an acknowledgement of country that help to build that understanding. And in that spirit, given the focus of today's webinar, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from participants across the world today. In Australia, there are hundreds of tribes, each with their own languages and customs, who have cared for this land, their part of the world, their country. Indeed, the same is true for all of you and colleagues all over the world who also have traditional custodians. I pay my respects to elders for all these lands, past, present, and emerging. So, as Ilaria outlined, we have two objectives for the webinar today. The first is to understand the System of Environmental Economic Accounts framework and its relevance to the headline indicators of the GBF monitoring framework, with a particular focus on those which the SEEA can inform, as well as to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities in using SEEA for national level monitoring of biodiversity. To do this, we have a number of presentations. The first is an introduction to the GBF monitoring framework. The second is an introduction to a system of environmental accounts, and specifically the ecosystem accounting framework that makes up the key pieces of that are used to report on the GBF. An outline of the GBF indicators that are based on SEEA ecosystem accounts and how they link to national level monitoring, reporting and use for policy. And we'll close the webinar with a panel of countries who will discuss some of their experiences implementing environmental economic accounting and how this can support country implementation of the GBF monitoring framework. During today's webinar, we will have a Q&A open. I see some of you have already put your welcomes in the chat. Thank you very much. In the Q&A, I encourage you to ask questions in there. We have an excellent turnout. We almost have 200 participants online right now. So ahead of time, I'll say that we may not be able to answer all your questions, but hopefully you'll find that the session to be informative. With that, I'll pass on to the first presentation, and that's to Gillian Campbell, who is going to give an introduction to the GBF monitoring framework and the headline indicators. Gillian is the head of monitoring, review, reporting at the UN Convention of Biological Diversity. She is responsible for the monitoring of the global biodiversity framework, including national action planning. Prior to that, she led methodological work on the Sustainable Development Goals indicators under UN Environment Programme custodianship. Gillian, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen as I get started. And I was looking briefly at who's joining this webinar, and it does seem like we have a variety of people. So for some of you, this may be definitely a recap, but hopefully this puts everyone on the same footing. Jonathan, can you see my screen?
I can indeed. It's not in presentation mode, but hopefully.
There we go. The bar at the bottom was in the way of the presentation.
Looks good now. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of a background on sort of the whole of the monitoring framework. Obviously, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, was adopted in 2022, December 22, in Montreal. And so then with the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, there was an ad hoc technical expert group that was established to guide the further development and finalization of the monitoring framework. This group then provides advice to a group called the Subsidiary Body on Scientific, Technical, and Technological Advice, and that meeting is coming up in May, and then that goes to the next conference of the parties. And so in December of 2022, the monitoring framework that was adopted alongside of the Global Biodiversity Framework included a list of different types of indicators. So it had headline indicators. These headline indicators are higher level indicators. There's 27 of them that have binary indicators. These are also high level indicators that are aiming to capture the overall scope of a goal or target of the framework. And then there's more detailed component indicators. These are trying to capture specific aspects of each target, and complementary indicators, which are more of a menu of indicators that are available. And so this was what was adopted in December 2022. And the way that these indicators were agreed in that decision-making process in the Congress of the Parties, 15 Congress of the Parties, was that they were supposed to be, they're aiming to be nationally relevant. And so there's national biodiversity strategies and action plans are the instrument for implementing the convention at the national level. So once we have a global framework agreed, then the action really takes place nationally. And so countries have agreed to develop their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or NBSAP, by COP16, which is in October of this year. Along with that development of the NBSAP, they're encouraged to use the headline indicators as well as other relevant indicators. And this is in the decision that's on the guidance for the NBSAP. This same decision, this 15.6 decision, also outlines how the indicators would be used in the national reports. So the national reports are a legal obligation to the convention, similar to the Climate Change Convention, where all of the countries report at a set time on their progress in implementing the convention and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The next round of reporting is in February 2020. Yeah.
Gillian, sorry to interrupt. The audio doesn't come quite nicely the whole time. Maybe if you lean towards, it's a little bit.
I'll try that.
Perfect.
Okay.
This is much better. Thank you.
So in February 2026 is when the national reports are due. And as part of the national reporting template, the headline and the binary indicators are part of this template. So the indicators that have been adopted, the ones where the ATAG has been focusing on the metadata, these are part of the reporting template. And so every country would then be requested to submit data on these headline and binary indicators. The headline indicators are quantitative indicators like you're thinking, whereas the binary indicators are actually not binary indicators at all. They're a series of questions that would be hopefully in the end able to give us some sort of a number of countries with this policy and that type of measure. Even though they are a series of questions, they're still aiming to be nationally relevant and to help countries to identify what types of actions and policies might be needed. And so then in the national reporting, there are 4 options for countries. The first option is that they report their own national data. The second option is if there is a global data set available, then they could draw data for that. So for instance, this may happen with the IUCN Red List. Maybe they would like to use the Red List. They could use a national Red List, or they could use the global Red List and pull it in. Same with protected areas. And then the third option is that they decide not to report any data and give a comment on why. Or the fourth would be that they say that this indicator is not applicable, and then of course they also then need to explain why it's not applicable. I think the fourth option would be quite rare, but it could apply to the indicators to do with fish stocks and things like that. And then the countries are encouraged to use other indicators, particularly the component indicators, but those are optional in the reports. And then all this information will also feed into the global review, which will try to give a status update on where we're heading in terms of achieving the global biodiversity framework, and that will happen at COP17. So this then led to the creation of this ad hoc technical expert group. It has 30 technical experts from countries and 15 from organizations. And it was mandated to finalize the development of the methodologies for the headline and binary indicators, provide guidance on disaggregations, on capacity needs, on gaps, on research needs. And so this group has just concluded its final meeting and provided its advice to SAPSTA 26, which is the negotiation process under the convention. SAPSTA is not expected to go negotiate the methodologies, as these are, of course, very technical, but to provide further guidance on operationalizing these and to recognize the work that's been done on the methodology. There was so many different groups that were involved in contributing to this AdTag. And if you go to the SEPSTA website or the AdTag website, you can find all of the reports and all of the different information documents that different groups contributed. There was a committee under the SEEA Technical Committee on Biodiversity Indicators, or a committee on biodiversity indicators was set up under the UNCEA that also contributed a lot to the work on some of the specific indicators, and this will be discussed, I think, later in Marco and Mandy's presentation. So it was very much a group effort, and if you look online, there are different documents. If you go to the CBD SEPSTA website, you can find the results of the AdTag. There you can find the recommendations, you can find the list of headline, binary, component, and complementary indicators with the disaggregations that are recommended. You can also find advice on the binary indicators and the status of the headline indicators. So there's a lot of material there, both in terms of the information documents and the recommendations if you want to see what is the status. And this is what the metadata looks like. It's very similar to the SDG metadata. It's 5 to 10 pages per indicator that provides a detailed rationale, methodology, method of imputation, information on data sources and definitions. And it's all available on the website. This particular one is for the indicator on restoration. So these are the indicators that are part of the list of headline and binary indicators. These are the ones that will be reported in the national reports. I am not going to go through these. I'm just going to very quickly show you that for each of the goals and the targets of the GBF, there's either a headline indicator or a binary indicator, or in some cases both, but usually it's an either or for many of the indicators, and this gives you an idea of what those look like. Some of them have brackets because there was a negotiation process that started on the binary indicators. And so, as I said, I'll share my slides. I'm not going through these. I'm just showing that every target does have some form of an indicator associated with it. And so, again, this is where the documents are. That AdTag is also working on providing an additional information document on capacity needs, spatial and temporal gaps, research and knowledge gaps, and that will be available later this month. And they also provided guidance on the disaggregations, as mentioned, and taking Section C of the framework into account. Section C of the framework includes having a consideration for different value systems, bringing Indigenous people and local communities into the implementation, ensuring that it's gender responsive, human rights based, that youth are involved. It includes a lot of different foundations for implementing the GBF. And so similarly to in terms of taking these different things into account when you implement the Global Biodiversity Framework, you also do need to take them into account when implementing the monitoring framework. And so the AdTag provided guidance on this as well. And on the disaggregations, the AdTag has provided guidance on using a consistent methodology for disaggregation across the different indicators. And I think that this is actually sort of a game changer in terms of where we're going, because in addition to having these standard methodologies, we would also try to have a standard approach for disaggregating ecosystems in particular across the different indicators. And so the AdTag recommended using the global ecosystem typology level 3, which is ecosystem functional groups, as the layer that could be used to disaggregate protected areas, ecosystem extent, the IUCN, the Red List of Ecosystems methodology, restoration. There's a number of different indicators that all could be disaggregated this way. They also recommended that when possible, you disaggregate by land tenure, which would allow you to see very interesting intersections of indigenous lands, and biodiversity. And so I think that this is something that is definitely going to improve the implementation of the monitoring framework. So as you may know, there's a series of webinars on different indicators. This one obviously is aiming at the indicators that are particularly relevant for the SEEA, but there's many webinars that the ATEG is planning on specific indicators, restoration, invasive alien species, protected area indicators. Those are all available from the website. So if you would like to join us for some of the other webinars, we would love to have you. And now I'll hand back over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Gillian. And as Gillian said, her presentation will be available online at the website the website for the webinar. Gillian was a little bit hard to hear here and there, so hopefully with that you'll be able to get all the information. But Gillian, thanks for providing an overview of the process that we've come to come up with the list of indicators for the GBF. Now we're going to focus in on the SEEA, and in particular the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting framework, and try to just, I guess, have a starting point for what this is about. This is particularly for people who the SEEA may be new to. So we have Marko Javorsek, who's going to present and talk about the SEEA framework. Marko is a statistician in the Environmental Economic Accounts section of the UN Statistics Division, where he works on the implementation of the SEEA and capacity development projects in various countries, advancement of the research agenda of the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting, and coordination of various global committees and working groups in the natural capital accounting space. Marko, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jono. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Marko Javorsek, as Jono introduced me, from the UN Statistics Division. And just to put everyone on the same ground, today I'll just make a quick introduction on the SEEA and the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting in particular. I see, as Julian said as well, I see many familiar names, but many new names to our community. So we thought that making a quick introduction to everyone would be very interesting and very useful. So for some of you, it might be a bit of a repetition. For many of you, it might be new information as well. So quick outline, I'll just talk a little bit about the motivation and the policy applications. What is the SEEA? What are the international statistical standard, and some country examples, talk about implementation, some guides and guidelines for and tools for implementation, and the SEEA and the GBF framework at the end as well. So let's start with some motivation for the SEEA. I mean, as we all know, the nature is very important, provides a lot of services to us for all, human well-being, economic development, and production. But the headline indicators such as GDP or other economic statistics that don't really capture the contribution of nature or the impact to the nature of such activity. So that's where the SEEA came in back in the 90s. The development of SEEA started to fill the gap, just to fill the to start integrating the nature and its contribution to human well-being, and also the impact of economy and the environmental production and the economic production back onto the environment. So SEEA really tries to bridge this gap between the economy and the environment, and to account for that in a consistent and coherent manner. And since the adoption also of the SEEA, and more recently the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting, there was a lot of also political interest, and a lot of some prominent names have really called this a historic step for making nature count. And also most recently, just to make the link with direct link with also Gillian's introduction to the actual monitoring framework and the global biodiversity framework, The SEEA is directly called on in the decision of the COP15 standard. It comes prominently featured in the monitoring framework. Also, the statistical commission is called for, and the statistical community is called for, to support the organization of the monitor framework, and other statistical standards as well. That is a very important and important link that is made between the biodiversity framework and the statistical community, and the SEEA in particular, to make these biodiversity metrics count and visible in the biodiversity area as well. The SEEA supports multiple initiatives. Obviously, these are many global initiatives that can be supported by development of environmental economic accounts, such as from beyond GDP, circular economy, climate change, biodiversity, SDG, etc. Also, the private sector is interested in the SEEA and the environmental economic accounting to account for their impact on the nature and the environment. On the other hand, I do not have listed here. There's also national initiatives and national policies that are very important, but those depend on every country differently and have to be accounted for such. The SEEA is, when I talk about the SEEA is basically the statistical standards that sort of underpins the natural capital accounting as an initiative. It is composed of two standards: the SEEA Central Framework, which was adopted in 2012, and the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting, adopted in 2021. Which is the most recent one. The SEEA really brings together the environmental economic data using the same accounting principles that are also aligned with the system of national accounts. So that is very useful to then integrate this information together with the existing development economic accounts. It's credible, reliable, replicable data, provides consistency over time because it uses this accounting framework. So it also provides consistency of the comparability and consistency of different data sources, and making the information more replicable and reliable through time. It provides some common language between the different communities, and it's important to mention that in the development of the SEEA, it was not only the statistical community that participated, but also many different communities, mostly the environmental, the economic, the geospatial community as well. So it really integrated different kind of communities to then try to speak the same language and improve the information between the different communities. On a national level, it's important to note as well is that it breaks down silos and fosters collaboration between different national agencies, between different national communities, because it does require this collaboration across the community. As I said, SEEA is two different parts: the central framework on the left and the ecosystem accounting on the right. The difference is that the central framework looks at individual environmental assets such as timber, water, fish, etc., whereas the ecosystem accounts looks at the ecosystems on a particular area. So it's the forest that provides certain services, or the rivers, the wetlands, etc. And they are sort of a common area, common ecosystems that provide some services to the human well-being. So let me zoom in a little bit more on the ecosystem accounting. It really is starting from this perspective of ecosystem asset that has an extent and a particular condition, and each ecosystem asset then provides some ecosystem services. We limit here to final ecosystem services because those provide directly the benefits to the society and the economy. But we can also look at the intermediate ecosystem services. Those would be the ones that are consumed by other ecosystems. So this link is very important because we want to have the link between the actual ecosystems with their extent and the condition, and then the well-being of the society through the accounting of and understanding, measuring of the ecosystem services that are provided. There are 5 main accounts in this SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. So there's the extent and condition account, as I mentioned initially. So they really account for the stocks of the ecosystems, and then the flows are accounted for by the ecosystem services flow accounts. Those can be either in physical or monetary terms, and at the end, once we understand the ecosystem services flow accounts in monetary terms, we can also understand and compute monetary ecosystem asset accounts. So those are accounts for ecosystem assets in monetary terms, sort of providing the bigger picture on those ecosystem assets. A few examples this maybe for some of you was very theory, very high level, highly brushed theory. So just a few examples of each of these accounts. So for example, ecosystem extent account, an example from the EU. Here we have a map of all the ecosystems that were identified in the EU. They can be presented in a tabular form. I have a map here just to illustrate that this ecosystem accounting is spatial. So we identify all the ecosystems in a spatial manner. So here the EU has divided all the ecosystems and with a legend of which ecosystems. Then in a tabular form we could actually also identify or show their extent and the evolution of the extent between different periods, which then sort of illustrates the change over time. Here it's important to mention, and Gillian already mentioned this, the IUCN Global Ecosystem Topology. So that is the sort of reference topology that was also adopted by the SEEA to be used for ecosystem accounting. It is also important for the biodiversity indicators, not only the ones related to SEEA, but many others, such as the one on Red List of Ecosystems as well, and so on. Then the second account is the ecosystem condition account. Here it's also an example from the EU, just because it's a nice depiction of a tabular representation of different indicators that are calculated for different ecosystems in the EU. So here it's just a table for rivers and lakes. We have a list of different indicators that are shown, their evolution, opening stock in 2010 and then a closing stock in 2020. And also a representation on in a graphic format. And the last account is the ecosystem services flow account. So here we have an example from South Africa, where we have 11 ecosystem services that were modeled for 2 different years. And in a map format, you can see them presented underneath. So there's just 3 examples, again, presented in a map, but also can be presented in a tabular format. This is just for 1 year, list of ecosystem services, and the provision of supply of the ecosystem services between the different ecosystems in columns. Again, here it's important to mention a reference list of ecosystem services. There is a reference list of 25 ecosystem services that is identified in the SEEA. And that reference list is important also for the link with the biodiversity indicators that we'll talk about a little later. Just a few slides with the number of SEEA implementations. So the implementation of the SEEA throughout the years has been increasing quite rapidly. We are around 90 countries implementing. And as I said, the ecosystem accounting is quite new from 2021. There was experimentation before, but the implementation is also increasing now. This is the map of the global map of the implementation. As you can see, the implementation of the SEEA is quite spread out throughout the world. Unfortunately, we do still have quite a bit of gaps, and we are working hard to help those countries as well implement the SEEA. There are many tools that can help countries. For you country participants here, they can be all found on our website at the SEEA.un.org, and you can find many examples, many guidelines, tools, and policy applications also to motivate the policymakers, as well as e-learning resources that can be found on our website. And my last slide is just to make a link with the next presentation as well. Is the SEEA is represented in the GBF in monitoring framework through various indicators. Most prominently, the two headline indicators: the on extent of natural ecosystem in goal A, and on services provided by ecosystems in goal B. Those are really covered from the ecosystem accounting. There's also in the indicator of 9.1 on sustainable management of wild species that it's still under development, and also a indicator in target 14, which is in italics because it's a component indicator, and also under goal D that we have some public funding indicators identified, and that would come from the central framework information. Thank you very much for the and this. I understand this might have been a very quick overview of the SEEA, but I don't know if there's any questions, and if not, we'll just continue with Mandy's presentation. Jonah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marco. I appreciate that introduction to SEEA. And yes, if people do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we've got a little bit of time to go through those now before our next presentation. As well, I did also pass over Gillian's presentation. So if and didn't give any opportunity for questions there, but if you did have any questions for Gillian, we can also take those now before moving on to the next one. So we'll probably take that. We'll probably spend about 5 minutes now on questions. So Marco, there's one question here around asking about, in the example of stocks and flows, why did the river or lake stocks go up or down? Is it an indicator of how the ecosystem is performing, i.e. how healthy, efficient the ecosystem service is, or how we value it, i.e. how commodity values go up and down? So can you explain a little bit about the, I guess, the different dimensions of what we're talking about when we're measuring stocks and flows in ecosystem accounting?
Thanks, Jonah. So there's so the example was on the condition indicators and of the rivers and lakes in the EU, and that is really showing the condition or the evolution of condition of that particular ecosystem asset. So it's really trying to pick the indicators that would be most illustrative for the condition for that for the particular ecosystem. Those indicators can range from physical state indicators, such as the length itself, the extent, how it all changes, to to chemical states. So you can look at the composition of how much different pollutants there are, or to the structure, how fragmented that ecosystem is. If you're particularly looking about forest, the fragmentation is very important because that impacts biodiversity, right? And so on. So that example was on conditions. So it really shows the condition of that particular ecosystem asset. So together with the condition and the extent, we sort of depict and understand the state of the ecosystem in different times. And from there, we can actually calculate and understand what the flows would be, which would be the ecosystem services. So obviously the condition has direct impact on the provision of ecosystem services, but doesn't have to be only seen in that perspective. Condition is important for it in its own right, and it's important to understand the condition for preservation and other functions of the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks, Marco. I'll get maybe there's a couple of questions here as well. I might just get one more, just noting time, and it sort of relates to what you were just talking about there. I was wondering about how the link between extent and condition on the one side and to the services on the other side is being made. How are services in SEEA ecosystem accounts affected by extent and condition or reduced condition? Did you want to talk a little bit about how, I guess, the sequence of accounts are sort of set together? That might be useful for that question.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for the question. That's exactly how the accounting framework is set, right? So that's why the sequence of the accounts. I mean, on one hand, the accounts are standalone, so they provide their own information and their own policy information. So the extent account, the condition account will provide their own policy information for conservation, and can be used and are useful in its own right. But obviously, in order to move on towards the modeling of the ecosystem services, we do need to understand the extent, the location, and the extent of the ecosystems. There is that direct link, but also then the condition. So the provision of the ecosystem services will definitely depend on the condition of those ecosystems. So that's the logic for the actual sequence of the accounts. But it is important to understand that it does not. The framework is set in such a way to present this logic, but also the condition and extent accounts are important in its own right and are not to be brushed over in that sense, just to understand the ecosystem services. On the other questions, I'll during the other speakers, I'll try to respond provide some quick responses in the chat as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marco. That would be fantastic. So we'll now go on to talking a little bit more about the indicators that specifically relate to the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting Framework, specifically A2, which is on the extent of natural ecosystems, and B.1 Services provided by ecosystems. And Mandy Driver is going to talk about those. Mandy is an expert in the field of ecosystem accounting, mapping and classifications, and is also the current chair of the technical committee of the SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. She's previously worked as Senior Biodiversity Policy Advisor at the South African National Biodiversity Institute for over 15 years, where she played a leading role in developing South Africa's ecosystem accounts. And I think that was one that Marco just provided an example of earlier. Mandy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jono. Just getting to sharing. Right. Okay. Am I all set?
Yes, looking good. Thanks.
Here. Fantastic. Okay. I can also just start my stopwatch to keep track of time. So it's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, to talk a bit more about these GBF headline indicators that are based on SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. I'm going to introduce the two main ones, indicators A2 and B1, and then have a closer look at each of them, and then finish off with 4 take-home messages. Introducing the indicators, I think all of you will be familiar with GBF Goal A, which has 3 elements: an ecosystem element, a species element, and a genetic element. And each of those has associated headline indicators. So for the ecosystem element, we've got the red list of ecosystems and extent of natural ecosystems. And then there's the red list index for species and a genetic indicator. And for goal B, which focuses on nature's contributions to people, there's one headline indicator, services provided by ecosystems. Marco's introduced us to the 5 core ecosystem accounts in SEEA. And now just to link those with the indicators, the ecosystem extent account is the basis for indicator A2, the extent of natural ecosystems. And the ecosystem services flow account is the basis for indicator B.1 Services from ecosystems. And Marco has also just talked a little bit now about the fact that this is a modular system, so one doesn't need to develop all the accounts at the same time. The ecosystem extent account is always the starting point because that is a foundation that's needed for the other accounts. The ecosystem condition account you don't need to develop in order to develop an ecosystem services account. So one can do an ecosystem extent account and an ecosystem services account. The condition account is often more complex to tackle. So I think in many countries it will be the case that they'll start with an extent account and an ecosystem services flow account in biophysical terms. So a little bit more about why an accounting approach is specifically useful for these indicators, and Marco has touched on some of these points. Accounting tables are really, an account is a table that's got a standard structure, and underpinning it are standard definitions and classifications. And that means it can provide consistent information over time and between countries. So an analogy here is with national economic accounts, which give indicators like GDP. That is also underpinned by standard definitions and classifications, so that we know when we talk about manufacturing in one country, it's the same as what we're talking about in another country, and that GDP in one country represents the same as what GDP represents in another country. And that's what we're aiming to achieve for ecosystems with SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. Marco also mentioned, and Gillian mentioned, that there is something called the Global Ecosystem Typology that was developed by the IUCN. And that is the reference classification for ecosystems in SEEA. And you'll see, I'll talk more about it later, it's really important. And then there's also the reference list of ecosystem services that Marco mentioned. That's another key classification in SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. A little bit more. So one of the advantages here is that because we have ecosystem assets and services in the same measurement framework, we can relate them to each other. That's very powerful. And then also ecosystem accounting is inherently spatial, and it's a single set of spatial data, or several data sets that are local, but then aggregated to national and global levels. So there can be coherence across all those different levels in the information that we use to support decision making. And then lastly, also as Marco emphasized, the principles of accounting are the same for the economy and for ecosystems. So we can start to integrate information across those. Gillian talked about the ATEG, the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group, and for the metadata for these 2 indicators, we have a task team for each that had members of the ATEG, members of the Technical Committee on Ecosystem Accounting, and some additional relevant experts. And those task teams have worked very intensively over the last 6 months to develop the metadata. Moving on to a closer look at indicator A2. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the rationale for the indicator, and then what do we mean by natural ecosystems in this context, and then how do we get from an ecosystem extent account, which has got a lot of information in it, to one indicator. Now, this is a little bit of detail here, which I'm going to step you through, so bear with me because I think it's important. So firstly, natural ecosystems are the foundation of biodiversity. Most of the world's biodiversity sits within natural ecosystems. And conversion of those natural ecosystems to anthropogenic or intensively modified ecosystems is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And that happens through human activities like urban development and cultivation. And it's reflected in the reduction of area of natural ecosystems. Conversely, there can in some cases be ecological restoration efforts that result in increase in the area of a natural ecosystem. So what we're aiming to track with this indicator is the extent of natural ecosystems as a proportion of overall area and how that changes over time. And it responds to wording in Goal A about increasing the area of natural ecosystems. We're not aiming, and there's quite a lot of discussion about this in the task team, we're not aiming to capture information about ecological condition because that's captured in other indicators, like the red list of ecosystems. Okay, so what do we mean by natural ecosystems in our current, for this indicator? And also after much discussion, we decided on a broad definition, including strictly natural ecosystems, if such things even exist anymore, and near natural and semi-natural ecosystems. And there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, semi-natural ecosystems often retain substantial biodiversity, so they're important from a biodiversity perspective. And that's in strong contrast to anthropogenic or intensively modified ecosystems, which have lost most of their biodiversity. Also, if we excluded semi-natural ecosystems, there might be an unintended consequence of reducing attention to their conservation and management. And then not least, there's no agreed scientific basis for making firm distinctions between natural and semi-natural ecosystems because they're on a continuum. So if we went for a narrow definition, it would have made the indicator extremely difficult to actually measure. Right, so that's a bit about the definition of natural ecosystems. Then what are the scope of those natural ecosystems? We used the global ecosystem typology to think about that. It's a hierarchical typology. And at the level of the ecosystem functional groups, level 3 of the typology, 98 of them are natural and 12 are anthropogenic. So that gives us a very clear basis for defining natural ecosystems for this indicator. What you see in this table is the list of the 12 anthropogenic ecosystem functional groups. You'll see they include things like croplands, plantations, urban areas, artificial shorelines, large dams. And the critical thing about those ecosystems is that their properties or characteristics are predominantly determined by human activities. Okay, now looking at a little bit more detail at what is in an ecosystem extent account. So the account tracks areas of different ecosystem types within an ecosystem accounting area, which for the GBF indicators would be a country, for successive accounting periods. And for each accounting period, there's an opening extent and a closing extent for each ecosystem type. In the metadata, there's a stylized example, this example here. And you can see there's the opening extent, additions and reduction to extent, and the closing extent. And those values for the opening and closing extent and the change in extent can be used to derive a range of different indicators that can be presented in a range of forms. To make it a bit more tangible, I've included an example from South Africa. This was the terrestrial ecosystem accounts that were published a few years ago. So don't worry about the detail. The point of the slide is just there's a lot of information in that table and it's very difficult to absorb. But fortunately, we can convey that information in maps and graphs and indicators. So on the right, you see the historical extent of natural ecosystems. And then on the left, a map that shows where anthropogenic ecosystems have replaced those natural ecosystems. And the national indicator that we drew from this account, we called an ecosystem extent index that shows the remaining extent of each ecosystem type, in this case summarized to biome, relative to its historical extents. And you can see which biomes have had the biggest declines in extent. So back to the issue of how we get from the account to a single indicator, we decided on an indicator of the extent of natural and semi-natural ecosystems as a proportion of the total area. And one gets to that by summing the closing extent of the natural ecosystem functional groups, and then dividing that by the total and expressing it as a percentage. So here's a mock-up of what the indicator might look like. And this is completely hypothetical, not based on any actual data. But you can see here for 10 hypothetical countries, country A has still got more than 80% of its natural ecosystem area intact, right down to country J, which has only got about 10% of its natural ecosystem area intact, the rest converted to anthropogenic ecosystems with a global average. One could also do a regional average. And that gives an easy to understand snapshot of the relative area of natural ecosystems at the national and global level. And One can do it, as is shown here, for all natural ecosystems combined, or you can disaggregate it by those different levels in the global ecosystem typology. And changes in this proportion over time will give us the information about whether ecosystem area is increasing or not. So a little summary of the methodology for A2 is to compile the extent account using a national ecosystem classification and ideally national spatial data on ecosystems, then crosswalk those to the ecosystem functional groups in the global ecosystem typology, calculate the indicator as I showed you on the previous slide, and then what countries will be asked to report is not only the indicator, but also the absolute extent per ecosystem functional groups, which allows then for global aggregation based on the absolute values. Moving on to indicator B1. And I know this is a lot of information to absorb. So we're going to look at the rationale for the indicator. Then the big question here is which ecosystem services to include, and then again, how to get from the accounts to a single indicator. So here, the rationale is that we're aiming to track trends in provision of ecosystem services, responding to the wording in the goal that talks about ecosystem services being maintained, enhanced, and those currently in decline being restored. So we want to show on average whether the provision of ecosystem services is increasing, stable, or decreasing. And we also want to be able to disaggregate by different ecosystem services. And ideally, we want to be able to disaggregate by ecosystem type, which is going to help provide information to direct efforts to enhance ecosystem service provision. And importantly, we're not aiming to capture information about the state of the ecosystems that underpin the services, because that's captured in the Goal A headline indicators. The big question, which ecosystem services to include in the indicator? Ecosystem services accounts are quite time consuming. So of course, in an ideal world, you'd want a massive suite of ecosystem services accounts for all ecosystem services, but in practice, it's usually a subset. So we went for a blended approach. So countries can select ecosystem services that they consider important. And then we also want to include some ecosystem services that are of global importance, like carbon sequestration and storage in ecosystems. So what that means is there will be one or more ecosystem services that will be required to be included across all countries, then a recommended list of ecosystem services with the option for countries to choose alternatives. And that's really important if you think about, say, a country like the Netherlands is going to have probably quite a different bundle of ecosystem services that are important compared to a small island developing state like the Maldives, which will be very different from a large arid country like Namibia. So there's not a one-size-fits-all to this issue of which ecosystem services to include. And then additional requirements would be to use the reference list of ecosystem services as a starting point that comes from SEEA Ecosystem Accounting, and very importantly, to include ecosystem services across the three broad categories of services, which are provisioning, regulating, and cultural. And you'll see why that's important in a minute when I show you some examples. There's also in the metadata a range of considerations for selecting the services. I'm not going to go through these now because of our time constraints, but maybe just to note the overall one is that alignment and compatibility with the overall intent of the GBF is a really important guiding principle here. Now a bit more detail on the ecosystem services account. So, and this is a little bit technical. So it records the flow of ecosystem services that are supplied by ecosystem assets and used by economic units, which could be households, businesses, or government in an accounting period. So it's the amount of each ecosystem service that's supplied and used in that accounting period. And a principle of accounting is that there needs to be alignment between supply and use. So ecosystem services are only included in accounts, the ones that are actually used. Ecosystem services that could potentially be used are not included in the account. We want to include as wide a range of ecosystem services in the accounts as possible. And we want to disaggregate the supply of services by ecosystem type so that we know which ecosystem types are providing which services. So here's the example from South Africa that Marco shared. I thought I'd go back to it. And the important thing to note here is that there are different units of measurement for the 11 ecosystem services that are included in this ecosystem service account. And what that means is that in getting from the account to a single indicator, we face this rather difficult challenge of how do you aggregate across different ecosystem services when they have different, they're measured in a range of different units. So the decision was to go for an average of trends in ecosystem service provision. For each ecosystem services, we calculate the percentage change relative to the previous accounting period, and then calculate a geometric mean, which is one specific mathematical form of an average across all the ecosystem services. And that gives an overall index of change. And importantly, we want to also have sub-indices for provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. And this shows why. So we tested this method with some countries that already have quite long time series of ecosystem service accounts. What you can see here, the black line shows you the overall index of ecosystem service supply. And then the red, blue, and green ones are the provisioning, regulating, and cultural sub-indices. And you'll see that within each country, those move in quite different directions, and they're also quite different across different countries. So that really is needed to get a meaningful picture. The methodology is select the ecosystem services, compile the accounts, calculate the index and the sub-indices, and then again, in reporting the indicator, countries will be asked to report the index and sub-indices, and then also the underlying values, so that there's some flexibility in how we aggregate those globally. Right, so last 3 minutes, some take-home messages. So firstly, ecosystem accounts are a powerful basis for deriving ecosystem indicators. They can provide a range of indicators at the national level, and they can also provide these high-level indicators that can be synthesized and aggregated to the global level. And then noting the account itself is not the indicator, and one needs that extra step to derive indicators from the account. Next, it's really important to think about the ecosystem-related headline indicators of the GBA as a suite of indicators that provide a set of complementary information. So we've got the 3 headline indicators for the goals, and then also target 2, area under restoration, and for target 3, coverage of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. And because all of these will be disaggregated by ecosystem functional group and then more detailed ecosystem types at the national level, it enables us to get a well-rounded picture. So for instance, if you think about an ecosystem type like mangroves, we'll be able to ask, is it threatened? How much of it is there still existing? What services does it provide, and are they increasing or decreasing? How much of it is being restored? How much is protected? And together, that gives us a really powerful set of information for informing conservation action. And then lastly, a pair of messages. And that the first one is that investing in foundational spatial data on ecosystems at the national level takes effort, but it really is worth the effort. And first and foremost, what one needs is a good wall-to-wall national map of ecosystem types at a baseline date. And that baseline date might be historical extent, or it could be a more recent baseline date. And then one needs spatial data sets on changes in distribution of ecosystem types at subsequent dates. And if one can align the national ecosystem classification with the global ecosystem typology, that is really helpful for achieving the global comparability that we're looking for. So just shown visually, that foundational data on ecosystems underpins the red list of ecosystems, ecosystem accounting, a range of other GBF indicators. It can also be used for SDG indicators. It's used in identifying key biodiversity areas. It can also be used for protected area planning at the national level, for informing biodiversity inclusive spatial planning in Target 1, and for private sector applications like accounting for impacts on ecosystems. So it's a worthwhile investment. And then, as we've talked about, several of those applications directly refer to the global ecosystem typology, and we might find more of them in future, also directly referring to the GET. And my very last slide is that level 3 that we've talked about, the 110 ecosystem functional groups, are really emerging as an important level globally. And we recognize that countries are going to need information at a finer scale than the ecosystem functional groups on the whole for national planning and policies. So the intention is not that those EFGs should replace national ecosystem types and classifications, but rather that for global reporting, national ecosystem types need to be crosswalked or corresponded with the EFGs. And there are efforts underway at the moment to develop guidelines that will support countries in that crosswalk effort. Right, that is it for me.
Great, thanks, Mandy. That was a really great. I guess it's an introduction, but there's lots of. I think there's lots more that we can certainly talk through when we start scratching the surface on both these indicators and others and other things that are related to the GBF here. We have got some questions in the chat, which I'll go to. But if others have questions, then please use the chat, and we'll use those to ask some questions. So I'll start with the first one that I've got here. What would 100% intact ecosystems look like? So I think this is for indicator A2, extent of natural ecosystems. Does it factor in urban areas? And if so, is it possible to achieve 100% in a country? Is there a target for countries to reach? I'm not sure, Mandy, whether you've got any thoughts on that.
Yes, so the 100% is, I'm not sure I'm completely understanding the question. The 100% is the total area of the country. So one wants to make sure that the ecosystem extent accounts for all ecosystems across the 100% of the surface area of the country. I'm not sure that there's any such thing as 100% intact natural ecosystem. Yeah. And so, yes, it does factor in urban areas, and there's one of the ecosystem functional groups in the global ecosystem typologies is urban and industrial areas. So those would be in there. They would have their own column, as would cultivated areas and so on. And then, there's not a specific target for countries to reach. I think, yeah. So it's really just an account of what's there, and then countries might be able to use that information to set targets around what proportion, what extent of ecosystems they'd like to retain and so on. But the account itself doesn't do that.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Mandy. There's a question here about the approach that's taken for natural ecosystems and wondering whether it was considered. So I understand the approach. The indicator is calculated on the summed extent of all ecosystems in a country. I was wondering whether it's considered to first calculate the indicator by ecosystem first, and then aggregate based on ecosystem area weighting for a country. In that way, countries would report both ecosystems, so basically looking at ecosystems individually, and then overall the natural ecosystems, which would provide a knowledge base for global trends. I think that's probably something just to work through around how that's defined in the ecosystem extent account.
So what I'm understanding from this question, if I'm getting it right, I think it's that issue that countries will be asked to report not only on their percentages, but also on the absolute amount for the absolute area of each ecosystem functional group in the country. And then that means that we can aggregate globally based on the absolute extent and get a proper global picture rather than just aggregating on the basis of the percentages from each country. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So whilst the indicator may be a percentage, I think is what you're saying, Mandy, the underlying data that you need to calculate that percentage is worked out at the ecosystem type level, which would allow you to aggregate across countries for different ecosystems. Exactly.
And ecosystem functional groups are shared between different countries. Most countries have around 10 to 12. So that, you want to get a picture for that ecosystem functional group across all the countries in which it occurs. And to do that, one needs the absolute values in those countries, not just the percentages.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Mandy. There's a question which is perhaps not specifically just related to the indicators, but it talks about that condition and also looks at ecosystem services provision. So that might be something that we might be able to provide the question about, is there any good examples that linked condition and ecosystem provision? So basically thinking about ecosystem capacity when accounting for services. As I think you said earlier, Mandy, the framework formally looks at supply and use of services, but doesn't necessarily measure capacity per se. I guess it does measure it implicitly in terms of changes in condition would be potentially an example of where there's capacity over time.
Yeah, I mean, I am not familiar enough with the sort of current state of ecosystems accounting in the world to know if there are good examples. There may well be, but one important point here is that the measurement of condition and the measurement of services happen independently of each other, and then one can use the information in those counts to analyze linkages between the two.
Yep.
And I'm sure there must be countries that have done that. Yeah. We haven't, in South Africa, we haven't got there yet. Right.
Certainly, I can say the same for Australia, both being diverse countries. This probably might be the last question I might ask in this section here. There are other methodologies other than SEEA. However, SEEA seems to be the most globally used by at the moment. Is it correct assumption for someone who's looking to choose a methodology?
Okay, so there aren't other methodologies for compiling ecosystem accounts. There are other methodologies for measuring ecosystem services specifically, and the accounting approach to measurement of ecosystem services is a particular approach that's based on accounting principles. And I think that's important for people to be aware of. So environmental economists have obviously been measuring ecosystem services for decades. And there may be countries that have a lot of information on measurement of ecosystem services through environmental, economic, and resource economists doing work. And it may well be that information can be very useful for this indicator. So I think, yeah, we need to recognize that ecosystem service measurement has been going on for a long time, and that the accounting approach is quite exacting, and one can get meaningful measurements that haven't necessarily been put yet into an accounting framework. Hopefully, eventually, we'll get to all of them into an accounting framework. I hope that's useful.
And I think that's a really, and I think that's what I was hoping you would say, Mandy. I think that this idea of ecosystem accounting and SEEA in general, I guess the way I think about it is an organizing framework for information and data as it relates to a range of environmental things, whether it's on the central framework side, which we haven't discussed here today, or on the ecosystem accounting side of things. And as you were talking about earlier, when you were talking about foundational spatial data being critical for not just for ecosystem accounting, but for a range of measurements that sit under both the GBF and other biodiversity policy at a national scale, it's really around understanding, that SEEA provides that sort of broader framework for integrating a range of different information sources and doing it in a consistent, coherent way. Which I think leads very, very nicely onto the next item, which is on country experiences. Mandy, thank you very much for your contribution to the webinar. I think it's been great to have that sort of introduction, and I know there'll be lots more questions, I think, as countries start to go to 2026 and implementing the GBF. So particularly as it relates to these indicators, we'll certainly be happy to answer some of those questions as countries will continue to implement. And like I said, this next session is on is actually going from talking a little bit about the I guess the sort of the theory behind SEEA and how it links into the global biodiversity framework indicators, and moving now to actually talking about what have been some country experiences in thinking about actually looking at ecosystem accounting. There was a question in the chat around what countries have actually implemented and how much. So I think this is I think this will be a good introduction to start to talk through some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that countries have faced in that. So we have 3 countries to present through today. We have Canada, Mexico, and Australia. And what we've asked for countries to do is to have a short, probably about a 5 or 6 minute presentation, just to give a little bit of an outline of, I guess, their the implementation that they have taken. And I guess they're sort of focused on sort of 2 elements in those presentations. One is talking a little bit about the interinstitutional collaboration and how has that been important in the implementation and compilation of SEEA accounts in the country, and how do you see this collaboration contributing to monitoring and reporting under the GBF indicators. And then the second sort of question is around what are the advantages of using an accounting framework as the basis of compilation of indicators for the GBF based on your experiences. So and once the presenters have given their introductory presentations, we'll have a round of questions to them all, where if you've got any specific questions, we'll work through what we get in the chat through there. So the first presenter is from Canada, and Francois Soulard, who is the research manager for the Census of Environment program at Statistics Canada, will present. Francois has worked in the field of environmental statistics for over 25 years and is currently the research manager for the Census of Environment program, which is Statistics Canada's initiative to deliver a picture of the complex relationships between ecosystems, the economy, society, and human well-being. Francois, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jono, and hello, everybody. I will attempt to share the screen. Yeah, so only a few minutes to talk about a pretty complex issue of interinstitutional collaboration for the purpose of generating indicators for the GBF. So I'll give it my best. And I'll do that by giving you a quick overview of the SEEA in Canada, talk about a few basic principles that I think will solidify what I'm saying, talk about the importance of collaboration for the GBF, and lastly, mention or explain why SEEA, according to me and my colleagues, is useful for the GBF. So I think it's important to set the stage for these few remarks on the, by saying that there's a long history of developing the SEEA globally, going back to 1992, I guess, the Rio Conference. And Canada has been involved since pretty much the beginning. So what I'm going to tell you is based on practically 30 years of experience in developing these accounts. So on the one hand, Canada has a fairly extensive accounting program, environmental economic accounting program, with some accounts going back to 1997 and other accounts being newer, for example, in environmental tax statistics. And these accounts are based on different things, including a survey program. So it's important to see that there's a real importance of designing the proper surveys that can feed the accounts. And then the accounts can feed the GBF. So there's a nice cycle from basic statistical activities in the National Statistics Office to the GBF. Now, those 3 principles that I'd like to mention is first, that we need to capitalize on external collaboration with key federal departments. Some of these departments have the data that is required, or at least some of the data that is required to do the accounts. And we need to fully leverage these data sets, the platforms, and to understand also the policy needs. You need to have a close collaboration between institutions. Now, there's also a need to leverage existing NSO, National Statistics Office capacity. National Statistics Offices have expertise in data science, in geomatics, in economic analysis. So it's important to also leverage all of that and not try to do the next thing, which is we need to avoid duplication of programs. Investment in our field is hard to come by. We need to avoid duplication of work streams, but maximize the overlaps. The benefits of the overlaps is that we can actually tie programs together and say way more if we understand where the other programs come from. So now, these are nice principles, but they're actually applied principles. Like here in Canada, at Statistics Canada, we have formal agreements with several departments, including the Environment and Climate Change Canada Department, the Agriculture Department, and so forth, where they both provide data for some of our accounts, but we also make sure that they understand our accounts and they are able to use them in their own policy making. So departments, but also academic institutions, non-government organizations, and of course international bodies as well, such as the UNSD and the CBD and the Global Oceans Account Partnerships and so forth. So collaboration is key. And I mentioned before that not only between institutions, but even within our institution. I've seen National Statistics Offices in some places where divisions and groups don't necessarily talk to each other and don't share information and data. That is something to avoid. Here in my program, we have formal collaboration with different groups, and that allows us to both go forward in our own program, but also, dare I say, educate the other programs on the importance of biodiversity and climate change. Now, here in Canada, because of our experience and because of the fact that we engage with policy departments, we are co-leads on 2 of the targets, and we support several others. Just this last Thursday, we had another release on ecosystem services, where we brought data in from other departments, such as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and our Natural Resources Canada department, but also information from StatCan, and we released data tables on ecosystem services on the provisioning side. And I'd like to pitch here that also helps us contribute to the target 14 of mainstreaming ecosystem services. By putting the data officially in the national statistics systems, it becomes available to all. So collaboration is particularly important for the 2 goals that are that Mandy presented today. I just talked about goal B, ecosystem services, but it's particularly important on the extent of natural and semi-natural ecosystems, because natural statistics offices often do not have the data in-house and needs to collaborate with other departments to create those maps of ecosystems. Now, I'll finish on 4 reasons why the SEEA is useful for the GBF. First, having an accounting framework encourages the consistency in concepts and terminology, and that allows us to speak for one voice, or at least understand what others are referring to when they present their own data. So the consistency is key. This consistency and the use of SEEA is also useful to integrate data with other socioeconomic information, be it health, be it social justice, and so forth. Encourages international collaboration. Our community is large and growing and vibrant, and having that standards allows us to talk to another using a common language. And finally, it also fosters capacity building. By having these fundamental principles agreed upon, we're able to help others go forward in their own path in creating these indicators. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Jono.
Thanks so much, Francois. I'll keep moving to the next presenter from Mexico. Andrea Cruz-Agnon is going to be presented from Mexico. She's the Director of Biodiversity Cooperation at the National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. Andrea is a biodiversity expert working since 2006 at the National Commission of Biodiversity of Mexico. She has coordinated the regional and national biodiversity strategies for Mexico, as well as the preparation and publication of the 5th and 6th editions of Mexico's national reports to the CBD, and has participated in international biodiversity negotiations to the CBD and the Intergovernmental Science Program Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. She is currently coordinating the update of the Mexican National Strategy on Biodiversity and the action plan in accordance with the GBF. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you guys are able to.
I can see it now.
Okay, so is it presenting in the right way?
Looks good to me. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take a kind of different perspective from our previous speaker. I'm going to, because I'm not a statistic specialist and I'm not doing the SEEA framework, another institution is doing it, but I would like to talk about the process of what Mexico is following to align our NBSAP to the GBF, and how the SEEA framework is going to fit in and to help us to report progress on that. So what the assumptions of the process is that we have an NBSAP with a 2030 vision, the MBMX, that was formulated with a comprehensive approach that involves many actors and many sectors that support the GBF. With that in mind, we also assume that federal institutions are the responsible for implementing GBF at the national level by establishing national targets within the scope of their authorities. And for that we have responsible institutions that have been identified based on their attributions and competencies, and the corresponding institution will be will have the responsibility of organizing the national targets, implementations, and follow-up in collaboration with other institutions and stakeholders. A very important context in this is that Mexico will change federal administration in October of 2024. We have elections in June, so we are rushing a lot to have national targets before the election time to submit to the CBD. And the process is that we already have an alignment process of our Mexican NBSAP with 6 axes, 24 lines of action, and 160 actions to the GBF. And what we have found is that our current NBSAP contributes a lot to the GBF. So what we have done is that we took the GBF and formulated proposals for the targets, the national targets. And now we are having intersectoral meetings. They are not really bilateral meetings because we have some targets where up to 10 institutions collaborate. And we are having these pretty much online meetings in order to have national targets and milestones. The milestones will help us to have some more clear image of what the targets are comprised on and where we have to do in order to comply with them. And we are also promoting voluntary commitments and involvement with private sector, youth, IPLCs, subnational governments, women, and other groups. The next steps will be to make these communications and dissemination materials. And once we have the national targets, we will have to review and update the monitoring systems that we have in place for the national biodiversity strategy. And we will have also, after that, to initiate the national report for CBD, having also policy and institutional coherence, a policy brief, and a cost effectiveness of biodiversity finance, and a governance proposal for the intersectoral commitments that we are putting in place. What we have done is, just very quickly, this is the alignment of our NBSAP with the CBD. As you can see, all the targets of the monitoring framework are complied by our NBSAP, and these are what we have done so far. So far, we have 47 targets, where at least 26 institutional agencies of the government have participated, allowing more or less 125 participants. It has taken us more than 34 meetings and 69 hours, which comprise more or less 779 man hours. And these are the kind of workshops that we have done. And what we have so far from these 47 targets is that we are finished. We have done only these targets, the ones in green. We have bending validation these other targets, and we have still to work some other targets in the process. There are some targets that have been very difficult. For example, the pollution one and the restoration one that will have special processes in order to be able to have some targets within that. And so the next steps, as I mentioned, once we have the 47 targets, we will review them with all the information regarding the headline indicators, the component indicators, the complementary indicators, and also the national indicators that we already have in our following systems of our NBSAP. And for this, I just will have these few minutes to talk about the Mexico ecosystem accounts that provide data for monitoring and tracking indicators of many international efforts, including the SDGs and the Kunming-Montreal GBF. And these accounts were prepared with the help of an interinstitutional working group in which CONABIO, my institution, played an essential role. We contributed with knowledge on special coverage of the whole rich life zones, Ramsar site studies, species red list, and a proposal to use the ecological integrity index as a synthetic indicator that incorporates the role of biodiversity in maintaining long-term ecological evolutionary processes. So the ecosystem accounts in Mexico are consistent of the data of ecosystem extent and services, such as recreational, aesthetic, regulatory services that helps Mexico to oversee our NBSAP. And these are the kind of indicators that we will be using and that we will be including in our NBSAP follow-up. And also in October of 2021, we have our natural capital accounting and valuation of ecosystem services project. And we had our first results, which is We have now extent accounts for 2002 and 2007, 2011, and 2014. We have condition accounts for 2004 and 2018, ecosystem services for 2013. And these ecosystem accounts will be updated and expanded were updated and expanded in August of 23. And now we have all these series of data now. So that would be it for me now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Again, I think I could definitely hear some, even though you're coming from a different angle, like you said, because of your different sort of experiences, not being an official national statistician, I can certainly see some of the things that you mentioned. There's definitely things that resonated with me being an official statistician, as well as some of the things. There were some things particularly in common with what Francois talked about, particularly around that interinstitutional collaboration. Final speaker for our panel tonight is Peter Meadows. Peter is the Director for the Centre of Environment and Satellite Accounts at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. He has worked on environmental accounting for nearly 25 years, both on the SEEA Central Framework as well as SEEA Ecosystem Accounting. Peter, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jono. My system seems to be playing up a little bit, so I might be just a talking head for the moment. I will just bring up my slideshow and yell if that's coming through, and I'm coming through there clearly, Jono.
You're coming through clearly, and I can see your slides as well on the right side.
Thanks. So like Francois, I guess the ABS has been involved quite heavily in the development of environment accounts and ecosystem accounts. I guess even from the beginning, we've been, I guess, quite strong presenters. There we go. Just a quick reminder that these are the kind of questions that we're kind of going to try and answer for you today. So how do we collaborate? How are we working towards A2 and B1? What are the advantages of actually using SEEA as a framework? So a bit of history for the ABS, and it'll link in back to sort of how we collaborate as well. So in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, we were really involved quite heavily in the development of environment economic account standards. We had quite close collaboration with our environmental ministry, our industry ministry, and this was particularly because it aligned quite nicely with some of the policy statements that were coming out at the time. So especially around how do we develop industry in and around environment protection and sort of building up those industries related to biodiversity and whatnot. So at I guess at a very officials level, we were interacting quite heavily, mainly as an advocacy level or for advocacy purposes, thinking about use cases, really trying to explore what the potential of the accounts were. We also established, I guess, a high-level group called the Environment Statistics Advisory Group, which pulled in, I guess, institutes who were advising government members at a fairly high level in the organisation, as well as some academic institutes. And these gave us sort of were instrumental in helping us design what parts of the work program we should be focusing in on. And at that stage, it was really around environment protection, expenditure, energy and water. We did also dabble in a few other areas, namely around fish and whatnot. And this part of the journey told us that collecting all that information was probably not going to be feasible as a statistical agency. So we had to actually work quite strongly with other agencies. So our agricultural economists in our Department of Agriculture, fisheries industry or fisheries ministries around the country, because fisheries in Australia are generally handled at the state level, and really trying to draw in that information. And in the mid-2000s and towards the early 2010s, and the sort of the build-up towards the signing off of the central framework part of the account, so this is purely dealing with natural resources. Again, we reformed that high-level group. It became the Environment Statistics User Group, so it was really focused on more of the high-level uses of environment accounts. And more we were relying quite heavily on agencies that were really looking into measuring aspects of Australia. So our geoscience community, for instance, through our Geoscience Australia, we're measuring land information. More information were coming from sort of our Ministry for Energy in terms of our energy information. And there was a heightened, I guess, work towards critical policy issues at that stage. So Australia was going through a millennium drought at that stage. So we were quite short on water, and it became quite a focus. And at that stage, we started to learn how to interact at fairly high levels across agencies to work out what was the best solution for measuring sort of environmental phenomena. And at that stage, things like the Water Act came out, where significant money was spent on measuring water. That actually went to our Bureau of Meteorology, so they collected sort of water accounting information. And we focused quite heavily on the other side of that, so how much water came out of the system and into our economy and whatnot. And because we had a developing resources-based economy, there was quite high levels of interest in terms of how much resources were coming out of the environment and where it was being deployed effectively across the economy. We were starting to see sort of indicators of some ecosystem stress and a lot of interest in that space, but that was more coming through some of the departmental reporting, our state of the environment, for instance, which was once every 5 years. We had fairly limited collaboration to sign off the natural resources part of the accounts, which in hindsight was probably not the best approach. We could have actually had closer relationships with those who were monitoring water and some of the geospatial agencies, as well as those who are sort of developing policy, mainly to sort of advise in terms of the usefulness of those accounts. Then we moved towards sort of the late 2010s and early 2020s. This is where I guess we've seen a renaissance in some respects in Australia in terms of our environment economic accounts. We developed a training course with one of the universities here, the Australian National Universities, and we use that as a platform for both training Australia and also locally in terms of our international neighbours in terms of environment accounts. And more, because ecosystem accounting was becoming a quite critical part of the environment economic accounts, we were more and more shifting towards that ecosystem accounting. At around about 2018, we had the development or the signing off of a national approach for environment economic accounting. This was really an interesting development because more and more environment economic accounts were being mentioned by ministers as a part of the sort of policy statements, or at least the broad statements of what we should be agreeing to do across I guess a national or federal perspective, as well as our state issues. And it was getting quite strong support for environment ministries. And in that sense, we were moving towards more and more towards the ecosystem side of things. So we're leaning away from natural resources and more pushing towards land and oceans. And there was also an interest in circular economy, so waste became quite an issue. And the next steps were really thinking through how do we embed the System Environment Economic Accounts, or SEEA. So there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment looking at how do we embed that further and further into policy. So we've got that quite high level discussion. And while we're developing the accounts, we're actually dealing more and more with academic interest to understand how ecosystems are measured. Because as statisticians, well, apart from me, most of us aren't ecologists, so we need that advice from people who are actually on the ground or are actually experts in the field in Australia. And that sort of moves us to where we're going to for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the ABS, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water, and CSIRO, one of our statistical science institutions, is now working towards a set of national cross-realm ecosystem accounts. So this is across terrestrial, coastal, marine, and freshwater ecosystems. It means that we'll have an indicator for A2 and some significant progress towards B1 by February 2025. The benefits, I guess, at the moment is that it's actually providing a set of common data inputs for both ecosystem accounting, but also biodiversity and condition monitoring, as well as any sort of move towards thinking about how we can set up, I guess, an equivalent platform or an equal platform for people to get access to sort of biodiversity and condition, as well as sort of where ecosystems are and what state they're in. We are working quite heavily through CSIRO at the moment, so we're trying a slightly different pathway. Instead of us going to a wide range of people, we're actually consolidating through a group of scientific experts. But one of the lessons I guess that's coming out of that is that we really, really need to work hard to balance scientific and economic needs for the accounts. So while there's quite a heavy reliance on scientific information, we also need to balance what are the economic constructs that sit underpinning the accounts that help link social and economic phenomena to sort of ecological or biodiversity outcomes. And then this brings us back to why SEEA. So Australia is quite heavily investing in SEEA because it has a number of different purposes. It helps us to support some of the international reporting that we have to do. So Global Biodiversity Framework, inputs into energy, greenhouse, and other reporting, for instance, and water, a lot of the surveys that come from the UN, for instance. But the way these are constructed also support domestic policy. This is because the ecosystem accounts and the environment accounts themselves are actually quite transparent. It allows us to think about what the indicators are and how they're being used in the community, and to sort of determine where the elements of policy are needed, but to also think about what's underpinning that in terms of an accounting construct, but then allowing access to sort of more detailed information. As I was saying, and what's been said by Mandy and whatnot, is that the ecosystem accounts are quite useful when you build them from the ground up because they have that scalable nature. And it's quite difficult to consider national ecosystems and determine what you're going to do in the local wetland. You really need to think about how to scale that information, but also how do you prioritize and how do you actually determine where funding should go and these sorts of things like that. So the ecosystem accounts allow you to sort of transition between your data inputs as well as the indicators of that. And one of the key features that most people don't understand about the accounts is that when you actually pull information together, it enables you to quickly understand what's actually missing. So if you just harvest the data that's existing at the moment, it will tell you when you put it into the framework what's actually not there and what you should be focusing on. And you can start to make those judgments about where to prioritize and what should be collected based on importance. And that's it from me. So back to you, John.
Thanks, Peter. I think that was a really great introduction of what's been happening in Australia. So I've got some questions that I'll ask now for each of the panel members. We've got about just a bit over 12 minutes left for this session. So got some questions here which I'll ask, and hopefully we'll get a chance to go through those as well as ones that have come in from the panel. I'll start to Peter. Peter, you mentioned about some of the accounts that Australia has been producing, including things like land cover and ocean accounts. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned during the compilation of these accounts, which can be used for the compilation of like Ecosystem Extend service accounts in the project that you just mentioned? And what are going to be some of the new challenges you think you'll face when combining those accounts for monitoring reporting of the GBF?
So land accounts were instrumental in us understanding how statistical agencies can collect vast amounts of land-based information. So some quick statistics, if you don't bear me. I mean, I'm a statistician, so I can't help myself. We collect information at a 25-metre grid across Australia. It ends up being about 38 million cells of data, which is quite difficult for some agencies to process. So we learned that we need to be clever in the way that we actually collect information, especially if you consider collecting 30 years worth of data and trying to put that out at the same time. It also taught us in the process of doing land that we need to consult quite heavily. Otherwise, we can produce products that don't actually make a difference. So when we transitioned to the ocean account, and this is where it was rather exciting for us because we worked quite heavily with the Ministry for the Environment, as they were at the time, and they helped us to focus really on a user-centered design approach. So instead of focusing on what were the accounts and what could they deliver, it was really focusing on what were people trying to change and how did they use information to make those changes. And then how could we align or prioritize that information to best suit what was being asked for. And that's where with the ocean accounts, we fell on sort of blue carbon ecosystems because there was quite a strong push, I guess, to understanding how much of that was available around Australia. But it also gave us, I guess, most of what we see sort of above in the northern parts of Australia as well, so mangroves and seagrass and whatnot. So it gave us a really good understanding of how people are, or communities are considering their ecosystems, and understanding that they're looking for not necessarily something that's related to a statistical geography, but related more to an ecosystem geography. So we had to scramble because most statistical geographies go to the high tide mark, but don't go beyond that. So it's kind of, when you sort of think about oceans, it goes below the high tide mark. So we really had to think how we could actually represent data in an efficient way. In terms of how that will relate to the global biodiversity framework, it's really balancing the discussion around what we need to do internationally in terms of that reporting. So we're getting quite strong guidance from our ministry and really using that as a way of talking through to the academics who are in this field and sort of experts in those particular ecosystems. But also understanding that there are other policy platforms that are going at the moment as well. So making sure that the data is available in a very granular level that can be used for either thinking about restoration, thinking about links to financing, thinking about links to sort of community and potentially our First Nations. So how can we actually incorporate First Nations information into the data that we have? There you go.
Thanks, Peter. A question for Andrea, based on some of the experiences you mentioned in Mexico. So I guess thinking about some of the future collaborations. So your institution, Kunming-Montreal, has a long history of collaboration with a range of different agencies, as you mentioned in your presentation, including the National Statistical Office in Mexico, in EGI, on the accounts and supplied input data for those accounts. How do you see that this sort of collaboration will look moving forward, particularly as you start thinking about the indicators A2 and B1 for the GBF?
Well, I think that the work that Kunming-Montreal and INEGI have done together to improve ecosystem accounting in Mexico has been very important, and I think that the work will continue to be very important in monitoring indicators A2 and B1 of the monitoring of the Kunming-Montreal. And when Kunming-Montreal and INEGI work together for these indicators, which look at the size of different biomes, ecosystems, habitat types, we can make sure that that we have the correct spatial data and the maps showing these features are available because of INEGI's skills on collecting and analyzing geospatial data, and that can be combined with Kunming-Montreal's knowledge of mapping and evaluating biodiversity to create complete and accurate data for tracking changes in habitat area over time. And I think that working together, both institutions can make easier to combine this data and to process large amounts of data. So going forward, I think that we will continue working closely. We just have had a meeting to see how we are going to approach, for example, target 11 on ecosystem services, which is it's going to be a challenge because the target says that we have to maintain all ecosystem services, and it's just a huge thing. And I think that that target resumes a lot of the work that the other targets are going to do. So what we need to do is how to reflect nicely that target, and we will have to work very closely with INEGI in order to produce this information, and we know that we have to update the ecosystem account and to continue bringing more information from other ecosystem services that are not taken into account right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think your response really highlights the importance of those collaborations and understanding the important roles that multiple organisations will play in ecosystem accounting in general, but also specifically here in terms of the reporting for the GBF indicators. Francois, I'd be interested to have your thoughts on, I guess, thinking about, where Canada currently is. Someone having a look from the outside. I think Canada has accomplished quite a lot with its ecosystem accounting program, particularly on its ecosystem extent accounts. And obviously, this has not happened overnight. And there's been a lot of work which you kind of had highlighted through some of the collaborations and things that you talked about earlier. Do you have any advice for what other national statistical officers which might be starting out with the compilation of these accounts might look to based on that experience?
Yes, thank you, Jono. So we have about 10 years experience in attempting to compile the ecosystem extent accounts and the other accounts as well. So in a minute, it's hard to summarize that. But I would certainly emphasize the importance of meeting, discussing, exchanging information with our stakeholders. And there are three types of stakeholders that we need to keep in mind when we build the accounts. That's the data producers, what data can we use out there and how can we access it. The data users, which are the policymakers and civil society in general, but also the data collaborators. Who can we work with in order to make these accounts happen? How can we create these accounts? So these three groups of stakeholders need to be involved in all phases of the accounts and the creation of the accounts. And I would also say that maybe this is truer for Canada, but it's also true for you in Australia and any large country. We have very diverse ecological profiles in the countries and large land masses and oceans. Canada is about 16 million square kilometers if we include our extended economic zone. So to say that we will be able to report on the extent of several categories of ecosystems in such a way that we would gain credibility with the scientific world all of a sudden is false. We have to go stepwise. We have to choose the ecosystems that we need to report on first by that discussion with our stakeholders, and we've done that. We've been working on ecosystem types per ecosystem type, but I'm happy to report that we've also managed to bring together enough momentum that we would be able to produce, I think, within a year, a full map of our ecosystems in Canada, which does not exist currently. So by working with our stakeholders, we are able to bring together the information, and I guess it represents investing in capacity building in a way. So I would stop there, but there's so much more to say about this topic.
There definitely is, but thanks, Francois, for that very, very short introduction to some possible first steps. I think it probably highlights, all the presentations today have sort of highlighted that this importance for interinstitutional collaboration for building ecosystem accounts across all the countries you've heard from today. It's not just about potentially with one area, as Francois has nicely put it. There's stakeholders, data providers, data users, and policymakers, which are all pieces of the puzzle. And particularly coming from a national statistics office where traditionally, the statistics are sort of, we might be a statistics house that, we might produce, we might collect, produce, disseminate, and be a whole component of that sort of production line, so to speak. Ecosystem accounts really demonstrates one of those areas where you can't be that. Whether it's through the data, whether it's through the expertise, as Andrea had said, or whether it's through the collaboration and user-centered design that Peter talked about. It really does require a range of different skill sets to be working together. So I was going to finish up there for the webinar. I wanted to thank all the speakers and panelists and presenters. It's been we've really only scratched the surface on what SEEA can bring to the GBF. And one of the things that we were hoping to do as a starting point here is to have this introductory sort of seminar, but also to have something with a bit more detail around the ecosystem accounts as well. And the next webinar in this SEEA webinar series is exactly that. We're going to be looking at implementation of SEEA Ecosystem Accounting and look at recent country experiences and the pathways to synergies with the global biodiversity framework, where we will get an opportunity to hear in a bit more detail about country experiences. That webinar is going to take place on the 20th of May, 2024. The team have kindly put that into the chat, so you can already register for that if you like. And we'll give an opportunity to hear in a bit more detail. And lastly, before I finish up, I did want to request if you had a minute or two, we do have a short feedback survey on the webinar, just for our own benefit, to make sure that if this is the first of these seminars that we have run, so we'd certainly greatly appreciate any feedback that you'd have, both on the content style and any thoughts that you have for improvements of what we've put together. So I will close there. Thanks again to our presenters, our panelists, and thank you to everyone for your time today. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
See you. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks.